예, 하셔도 이제 시작하시면 될 것 같습니다.
일단 시작하겠습니다.
예, 이제 황모식 선생님 교수님께서 이렇게 소개 간단하게 하고 바로 시작하면 되지 않을까 싶습니다. 인사. 예.
Can you see yourself clearly?
Everything looks good.
Looks good. In that way, you can make your...
Oh, Vicky's there. Hi, Vicky.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
Good, good.
Okay. So it's Professor Che and Professor...
I'm Cha.
Yeah, Cha.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Professor Huang.
예.
Nice to meet you. Nice to meet you. And thanks for having me in this wonderful, collaboration.
I think he's...
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Before we start, I think Professor Huang is introduce Bacillus, Professor Bacillus. Yeah. We have time to introduce time Bacillus. Yeah, after that, the Bacillus lecturing is start. 교수님 시작하시면 될 것 같습니다. 교수님 죄송한데 마이크가 꺼져 있습니다.
아, 예. 소리 들리십니까?
Can you hear me?
예, 오늘 함께 하신 모든 분들을 환영합니다. We sincerely welcome everyone who joins us today. 오늘 공고한 대로 바실리우스 아드라타스 교수님 모시고 세미나를 진행을 하려고 합니다. Today, as announced, we will be holding a seminar with Professor Basilis Adratas. 바실리우스 교수님 여기 이제 광고한 대로 소개시켜드리면요. 바실리우스 아드라타스 teach Islamic study at West Sydney University and he is the convener of Greek study at the University of NSW. He holds a PhD in the sociology of religions from Petain University of Social and Political Science, attended Greek and a PhD in study in religion from the University of Sydney. He has been teaching at a number of universities, both in Australia and overseas, since 2002. His specialization is in the political phenomenology of early Christianity, patristic, Byzantine philosophy, the history of religions, and indigenous Austrian study. He has also and co-edited more than 10 books. I will end my introduction to the professor here. Then here start the lecture. 예, 그러면 강의를 한번 해보겠습니다.
Yes, it's time for you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Professor Huang, for your introduction. It's a pleasure to be with you and to have this collaboration with the Patristic Society in Korea. Actually, to be honest, I didn't know until quite recently that there was such a society in Korea, South Korea. And when I learned about it, I contacted Koen Young and asked him, what is this all about? And he gave me some initial, information. And then I had the idea, why don't we do something? And that's what we're having today. We are, seeing this idea being realized. I want also to say that I was talking about this lecture with the Orthodox Metropolitan of Korea, Ambrose, and he was very surprised, and very excited to hear that, this lecture was going on. As you know, he's a patristic scholar himself, and he showed very much interest in this lecture taking place. As you can see, my topic today is going to start with this idea that comes from the ancient church and encapsulated in the words of Tertullian. Quid ergo Athenis et Hierosolimis? So, what common is there between Athens and Jerusalem? So I'm going to look into this tension between, the Athenian, Greek, Hellenic legacy and the Jerusalem, Hebrew, and Israel sort of, background. These two things coming together and becoming something new, entirely new, in the form of Christianity. The Sydney Patristic Forum for 2024 is going to be basically focused on the relation between philosophy and theology and how this was worked out during the period of Byzantium. So this is why I thought a topic such as this is most pertinent. Now, as you can see on my PowerPoint, I have, on one end, the icon of Saint Gregory, the theologian. Now, in my church tradition, the Eastern Orthodox Church tradition, today is the feast day of Saint Gregory, the 25th of January. So it's a double sort of pleasure that, we are having this talk. Now, of course, this is only an exploration of the relationship between faith and knowledge, philosophy and theology in patristic thought. It's a very debated issue. It has been, talked about and again discussed in scholarly circles. I'm trying tonight actually, to bring to your attention a new way at looking at this. So I'm just going to read my abstract. This seminar talk will focus on the epistemology and methodology of the dialectics between philosophy and theology in patristic thought, especially in the Eastern Roman Empire. Firstly, the phenomenology of faith and knowledge will be explored as a pertinent background to the whole discussion. And then an analytical framework regarding Hellenism will be presented in order to show that the distinctions that have to be made, absolutely, if one is interested in a critical inquiry. Finally, the theory put forward will be applied in a specific case study, namely that of the Cappadocian Fathers. So the next slide. Why and how is the question, the problem posed? Now, in many respects, this question about the relation between faith and knowledge, philosophy and theology, is a peculiarly, specifically Christian phenomenon. We also have it, in Judaism and Islam, or in other, worldviews or religious, traditions, but it basically originates in a Christian framework and it's exported from that. Now, it's a Christian phenomenon both in a pre-modern sense and a modern sense. However, in modernity, that is after 1500s, it is particularly pronounced. It's very intense, especially after the Enlightenment. Now, why? The why. Why is this happening? In a pre-modern context, it's happening because we have the encounter between nascent or the original, starting Christianity and Hellenism. So you have on the one hand something that is not tuned in with philosophy and something that is immersed in philosophy. The second reason is there was a need to retain, keep, safeguard divine transcendence in the face of divine immanence. So, in the sense that since Hellenism, as we will see, is about divine immanence, when you take in Hellenism, okay, you take in philosophy, you take in immanence, but then you have to keep God transcendent. So you have to keep the faith dimension as well. Otherwise, you're just going to become a Hellenism or part of Hellenism and nothing more. And third, the effects of secularization. In modernity specifically, it's the effects of secularization that make this problem between faith and knowledge, faith and reason, and rationalism, science, much more of a contradiction. Now, how is the problem posed? How is the question posed? There is a range, a spectrum of answers here. It starts from contradiction. There are those who think that, these two elements, faith and knowledge, are contradictory. There's those who think that's just a difference. Then we have those who think it's a complementarity. Okay, philosophy and theology complement one another. And on the other end of the spectrum, there are those who think that the two elements, are associated or related in terms of elective affinity, what Max Weber would call elective affinity. So they match, they are compatible. Next slide. Now I would like to go into some methodological considerations. What I'm trying to do tonight is an exercise in the phenomenology of patristic thought. Generally, when we talk about patristics, we have in mind something very, let's say, philological or historiographical. But there's much more to patristics than that. There's patristic theology. There is the understanding of the mentality of the fathers of the church. And this is what I would suggest by the term a phenomenology of patristic thought. Now, in doing this phenomenology of patristic thought, I have in mind, and I will be applying a personal method, which I call hierophanic hermeneutics. Because phenomenology is all about hermeneutics, verstehen, to understand something, you cannot, in my opinion, understand anything that pertains to religion, spirituality, if you may say, or more broadly, anything that pertains to the sacred, if your method is not sensitive to that. You're simply going to betray. So in order to have a method, a hermeneutics sensitive to understanding sacred things, sacred experiences, this hermeneutics has to be hierophanic. It's a Greek term. It comes from the very famous historian of religion, Mircea Eliade, and it means something that reveals, manifests the sacred. So a hierophanic hermeneutics that I'm applying is a hermeneutic that looks into the other, the distinctive and the irreducible. Faith and knowledge are to one another other, irreducible and distinctive. But at the same time, in a very peculiar way, within Christianity, the Christian experience, they become the same, they become equivalent, and they become commensurable. Now, this hermeneutics is critical, of course, because it's scholarly, it's academic, it's supposed to be that. So it's also a critical approach to the dialectics involved between faith and knowledge, philosophy and theology. And lastly, it draws on a number, you will see as I go on, 6 actually, a number of distinctions when it comes to Hellenism. And also it has a very heightened, very pronounced focus on the historicity of each patristic figure, school, or period. Because not all fathers are the same, not all periods are the same in the development of patristic thought. Not all schools, okay, are the same. Schools, inverted commas. And let's go to the other slide. Let me now go into the proper discussion of my lecture. Faith and knowledge, number 1. Now, allow me to start also using my notes here. Now, in order to grasp adequately knowledge on the one hand and faith on the other as something fundamentally irreducible and distinctive, we will have to grasp the anthropological types, or in other words, the types of experience, of agency, and subjectivity that these two things represent. This fact presupposes the apprehension of those types in relation to what the types themselves regard as their point of reference. Consequently, we are in need of a methodological, exclusion of the different denotative elements that they have, and at the same time of a methodological focusing to their unique connotativeness. So we have to exclude, when we talk about faith, we have to exclude what we don't mean and focus on what we really mean. When we talk about knowledge, we have to exclude what we do not have in mind and focus really on the core, the gist of the thing. So this is an exclusion-inclusion dialectics. Clearly, methodologically. Of course, in order to get what is the gist of these two experiences, one has to understand what is their sacred foundation. Now, when someone approaches faith and knowledge, in effect, they approach a set of Hebrew and Hellenic forms of human life, respectively. In terms, historical terms, but also anthropological terms, the human being par excellence, the figure par excellence of knowledge is the Hellene. While the figure, the human being par excellence of faith is the Hebrew. This does not mean that knowledge is some sort of monopoly of the Hellenes. We have, for instance, in the Indian subcontinent, we have the tradition of Jnana, which is gnosis, it's knowledge. We have Veda, which is, theory. And of course, it doesn't mean that faith is only to be located within the Hebrew experience. What it does mean is that the faith and knowledge, the Hebrew and the Hellenic worldview, respectively, are the most indicative, most typical, or in other words, the most pure fields of reference when we refer to these two dimensions. Besides, in the case of Christian theology, faith and knowledge come from very, very specific geographical, historical, social, and religious spaces. That is, from the Hebrew experience and the Hellenic experience. So they don't come generally, and loosely from somewhere. Now, knowledge primarily and basically is related to the emergence and development of ancient Greek philosophy. By extension, it refers generally to the Hellenic way of living, of life. What we could call in Greek, Ellinotropia, Hellenotropy, the tropos of the Hellene. This latter, understanding of Hellenotropy constitutes a set of denotative characteristics amongst which we could identify the most important, and this is rational thinking, individual political engagement and participation, aesthetics as ethics, or ethics as aesthetics, and of course Olympian religion. These are the elements, by the way, that Cornelius Castoriadis identifies as the quintessence of the Hellenic. Now, the Hellenic foundations of knowledge are not limited to Hellenotropy, which probably alludes to something that we could understand as the historical continuity and coherence of its own self. What I'm saying here is that in the long history of the Hellenic civilization, we have phases, periods of Hellenotropy, and that's not always the same. So Hellenotropy is not only what we see, for instance, in classical Greek or 5th century, but it's also a kind of continuity and coherence from period to period. But in order for this to be substantiated, and make sense, what is the Hellenic eidos, form, essence, as a phenomenon in time and in reality? Is there something behind all these tropes, an eidos, a phenomenon? And if there is, what is it? For the Greek, the Hellene, the entire, way of living is expressed as logos. Logos is the entirety of living. And this is a relationship between the individual and society, on the one hand, and the ultimate sacred foundation of life, on the other hand. In other terms, this relationship is constituted, or is supposed to be constituted, constantly, incessantly, between on being, the human being, and ine, which is the divine being, capital B. That is, it is constituted as ontology. And to be very, of course, more precise, it's ontognoseology, because gnosis is the in-between, is the mediating factor, agent between on and logos. So, we could regard, and here we can move the slides. We could regard that knowledge constitutes the most important and the highest mediation between the incomplete nature of the human being and the complete nature of the sacred. And in this sense, knowledge should be understood as a hierophanic performance par excellence. So for the Hellenic experience to know, knowing, it's not just, sitting, at a desk and reading a book and getting information. Knowledge is realizing oneself in a hierophanic manner, which is in a manner that connects them, whoever they are doing it, with their sacred, which is, of course, physis, inner being in general. Now, thanks to this, knowledge, the Hellene puts into action their innate possibility to discover being, capital B, and by extension to deepen their relationship within this being, and at the end to become one with it. Nevertheless, this by no means is to be, understood as a one-dimensional intellectual process. No. On the contrary, it is a holistic, experiential, phenomenon. The process of knowing does not secure, we can go to the next, we are still one, sorry, the last one. The process of knowing does not only secure the positioning within the world, but also the unification with the world. Now, on the other hand, faith is related to the consolidation of the Hebrew religiosity, and by extension with the mentality that permeates the historical development, the social construction, and the cultural identity of the Hebrew people. In particular, this mentality refers to the self-consciousness of election, which is calling. It also refers to the bindingness of the Athiki testament, Berith, and the promise and hope of historical restoration. Now we have this anthropological triad, trinity, and one can see through the light of this triad that for the Hebrew experience, faith is expressed as a belief, as something that is worth believing, and also as trust. Nevertheless, the distinctiveness, the peculiarity of faith, again, is not to be reduced on what the term denotes, but on what it connotes, what is beyond it, what substantiates it, and what is this thing reflected through faith. Now, for the Hebrew experience, the human being is what it does, what it acts out. Better, the human being is what it is called to act out, to do. the Hebrew experience has a past that has elected the people and calls the people to treat the present with the appropriate responsibility regarding the future. In particular, the Hebrew person feels the paradoxical necessity of the will to be accepted, to accept, to consolidate, and to enhance the sacred will, the sacred as will. Now, this sacred as will, or this sacred will, is the revealed, Yahweh. But this revealed Yahweh as the sacred will does not bind, the human being, the human will, but calls it to faith, so that a certain meaning can be given to action. So that action, what we do, can mean something and not just be, something done. Now, in this respect, the peculiarity of faith comes down to the fact that the human being is a praxis, response to the big praxis, big calling of Yahweh for the creation of a dynamic that can put life in the serving of a purpose. With faith being, realized, the human being does not simply locate itself in history, in a certain sacred history. Not simply that. But more so what? It binds itself, basically, primarily, so that this history, sacred history, is recreated again and again. How are we going about the time? What's the time?
We have 30 minutes to go.
30 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Now, let's look into some of the, next slide please, the hierophanic aspects of faith and knowledge. Now, in the case of knowledge, we have, as we said, the union of the person, the human being, with nature. And this is only, when this is done, it comes out as truth, aletheia, wisdom, sophia, and immanence, emenia, immanence. Now, in the case of the recreation of history, the Hebrew experience, when faith is realized, it comes out as holiness, salvation, and transcendence. Next slide. So, truth, aletheia, is anthropological, cosmological, and ethical. It's anthropological because it involves human knowing. Cosmological because human knowing is supposed to resonate with something out there in the cosmos. And ethical because this correspondence of me as a knowing agent and the aletheia of the cosmos has to find a way to become embodied in praxis. So that's why it's ethical at the same time. So in one word, ultimately, it's ontological. Wisdom, on the other hand, involves the entire human condition to which the Hellenic Weltanschauung refers. And the Hellenic immanence constitutes what we would call Ellinotopia. So we have, the expressions of the Hellenic experience, which are Ellinotropy. We have what is behind them as a foundation, as the basic sacred, reference, point of reference being reflected through those ways. And this is Ellinoidia. And now we have Ellinotopia. Okay, when you really become one with nature, one with the ethos of being, and you become more in your space within and place within nature. Okay, this is Ellinotopia. Now, historicity, on the other hand, we have to just change, I think, here.
Yes, right here.
Yeah. Historicity, now we go to the Hebrew experience. Historicity is all about sanctification. It's not about knowing, it's not becoming wise, it's not becoming immanent, more and more yourself, that's immanent. It's becoming sanctus, sanctification, okay, of the individual and the collective. And this sanctification is not something general, you become more yourself. We hear this a lot nowadays. Become more yourself, your authenticity. No, sanctification is about embodying in time, in place, the thelima, the will of Yahweh. And in this sense, Yahweh and salvation become sides of the same coin. Next slide. Now, it's good to look into a genealogy here, because as we said, this Hellenic experience, this Hebrew experience, they were there already when Christianity comes into the scene of history. Okay, they are there and they have already, found ways to communicate since the classical era, but very much more from the 3rd century and 2nd century BC. For instance, we see this in the sociological literature of the Bible, okay, where we have, the influence of the Hellenic spirit. And of course, even more later, for instance, when we come to the writings of Philo of Alexandria. So we see this influence of the Hellenic spirit on the Hebrew, experience. But at the same time, there is we must pose as very reasonable the influence and the impact of the Hebrew spirit on the Hellenic. This has not been studied as much. Quite recently, it was regarded as a taboo for scholars. No way that the Hebrew experience could have, influenced the Hellenic one. But there are certain developments in the Greco-Roman world, that is late Hellenistic period and early, the early Christian era, and of course the early late antiquity. There's certain developments like, the understanding more and more of the unity of the divine, okay, the oneness of the divine, the transcendence of the divine, or the demonic, the notion of the demonic. These issues point to a certain influence from something somewhere else. And we must assume that amongst the, Middle East influence, the Hebrew element was also a very, very important factor. Now, these things have created, interaction and impact, and when Christianity appears, slowly this builds up more and more. First with the so-called apologists, the apologist fathers of the church. And with the apology fathers of the church, we see that Okay, now we have to confront Hellenism. We have to, discuss, we have to talk with Hellenism. It cannot be differently if we want the message of Christ, to go further into history. So, if we are going to confront Hellenism, we have to confront Hellenism on its own grounds, and that's on philosophy. Now, a step back. Is there a Christian stance towards philosophy in the New Testament? Yes and no. For instance, we could say that generally there are two different mindsets, outlooks regarding philosophy in general. New Testament writers are not very much interested in philosophy, but when it becomes a pastoral problem, they are, and we have two, let's say, stances. One is, look, cautiousness. This thing can be very, very, tricky and very, very risky. And the other one is, let's engage with it, let's take it on, and let's make something out of it. So, for instance, in the work of Luke, which is, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles, in that, text, and the literature under the name of John, we see an attitude towards Hellenism which is, quite open. Okay, let's talk. Whereas, for instance, in other texts of the New Testament, especially the Deutero-Pauline, literature, we see there that, the writers are very, very, ambivalent and very cautious regarding it. Now, after the Apologies, the things become even more, of take on sort of reality and mentality. And we have the School of Alexandria, Clement of Alexandria and Origen. And then both of them affirm that knowledge and faith make up a single history. Now we go together, but it's always precarious. We always have to be, careful. We go together hand in hand, but let's see, which hand is going to not, just hold too tight on the other. So the great temptation for eschatological realization and consciousness. Yep, Ken Woon is telling me that we have 20 minutes. So I'm going to skip some of the parts so we can go really into more concrete cases. Now, there is, always a new way to look into an old problem. The dialectics between Hellenism and Christianity, found in the work of the Cappadocians. We can go further down, if you like. So let's further down, further, more. Let's keep it there. Okay, the dialectics between Hellenism and Christianity found in the Cappadocian Fathers required a firm analytical framework in order to be accounted for and justified. Accordingly, I propose two conceptual triptychs, the 6 distinctions I was talking about, and one set of methodological distinctions. Firstly, when one studies the engagement of the Cappadocians, and more generally the engagement of the Church Fathers with Hellenism, the first thing they should have in mind is that Hellenism involves 1. Hellenoidia, that is, the very phenomenon that makes Hellenism distinctive. 2. Hellenotopia, or what is the spatio-temporal continuum that became the living space of the Hellenes. And at the end of the day, that was nature. And Hellenotropia, or Hellenotropy, that is the differentiated, comprehensive, and genuine set of modes through which the Hellenic is realized in space and time. Regarding these realities categories, it could be said that while experiencing the disintegration of Hellenotopia during the late antiquity, the Cappadocians were open and eclectic as to Hellenotropy, but very critical of Helenoidia. In other words, although they could easily use this or that tropos of the Hellenic, literary genres, philosophical schools, artistic traditions, ethical conventions, religious elements, and so forth, they were particularly wary about the ethos of the Hellenic. For they clearly understood that as far as the distinctiveness, irreducibility, and novelty of Christianity was concerned, this ethos was the crux of the whole matter. But what exactly is Hellenoi? What exactly is the phenomenon that makes Hellenism distinctive in its own right by means of contemplating and imitating nature through the pursuit of rationally justified knowledge? Here is where my second conceptual triptych comes in. Although Hellenotopia became a reality through a trajectory in time that united and homogenized a variety of localities in the Mediterranean and the Near East over 4,000 years, and despite the fact that Hellenotropy has always been a differentiated set of social cultural resources, Hellenism has always been seen as a distinct entity. Regardless of the ever-changing continuum within which it was manifested, or the diverse legacy it gave rise to, the integrity, oneness, and identity of the Hellenic were always taken for granted. However, this unity in diversity complex that is evident in the case of the Hellenic, or better in the case of Hellenoi, took basically three forms, which I would like to categorize as follows. 1. Cataphatic Hellenism. Cataphatic Hellenism, apophatic Hellenism, and preeminent Hellenism. Cataphatic Hellenism, or in modern terms we could call it perhaps more aptly positive Hellenism, was the type of Hellenism that reduced Hellenoi to one or more modes of Hellenotropy. More specifically, due to the powerful challenge of the other, and in particular Christianity, certain Hellenic circles opted for a definitive and fixed identity, mainly on the basis of religion and of philosophy. For instance, the Neoplatonic schools or the alleged restoration of Hellenic religion under Emperor Julian. Now, in turn, apophatic Hellenism, or what we could call, more aptly in modern terms, indeterminate Hellenism, was the type of Hellenism that refrained from identifying Hellenoi with any of the modes of Hellenotopia. To be sure, this remained by far the most prevalent attitude of the Hellenes towards their own identity, allowing the latter to be elusive and fluid and by extension adaptable. Lastly, preeminent Hellenism, or we might call transcendental Hellenism, is the type of Hellenism that did not just refrain from identifying Hellenoi with any of the modes of Hellenotropia, but took the former as transcending, enriching, and reconstituting the latter. This was the type of Hellenism that the Hellenes who converted to Christianity experienced and identified with, since it brought forward Hellenoi as a kind of intentionality in time that yearned for its future fulfillment. In light of the above, one can start appreciating what actually happened in the case of St. Basil, St. Gregory, and St. Gregory of Nyssa. With Hellenism, their primary concern was not to find similar or compatible elements between Christianity and Hellenism. No, that's not the point. But to keep their faith, not knowledge, faith, intact over against the Hellenic, and at the same time claim the latter, the Hellenic, for the kingdom of God. For this reason, they did not trouble themselves so much about this or that mode of the Hellenic, but instead focused on how they could accommodate the ethos of the Hellenic without confusing it with the experience of divine revelation, faith. The remarkable thing with the Cappadocians is that they did not seek an easy or superficial solution to this problem, but on the contrary, confronted it head on. They discerned the core of the problem. They pointed out the actual weakness of Hellenism as its potential strength. It was trying to realize something, but it couldn't make it. But this trying, this attempt, was its strength at the same time and its weakness. And the Cappadocians embodied the transformation required within their very thought, work, and life. The transformation of Hellenism, which is transformation of knowledge and philosophy, this transformation effected by the Cappadocians was something qualitatively different to what had already been happening since the first century in Christian theological circles. For instance, New Testament, apologists, and the School of Alexandria. That was a preparation and a kind of sorting out of things. This was a realization and a reconstitution, a new heaven and a new earth, according to Revelation 21:1. A new history. How many minutes do I have? Sorry, just have to keep time.
Yeah, 12.
12.
Yes.
Now I'm going to go right into, the fathers, the Cappadocian fathers. Saint Basil the Great on ontology. In his exegetical homiletic work on the 6 days of creation, namely the Exaimeron, Saint Basil the Great articulates a number of themes that would become typical of Christian ontology. The dialectics between the uncreated and the created. Humanity's image and likeness in its capacity as contemplator mundi. The eschatological fulfillment of all creation in the glorified human nature of God, the Logos. And humanity's proper responsibility to know the created order and foster the course of creation towards perfection. His philosophical background, so to speak, in this regard is basically Stoic. But what he manages, as the following passage, the one I'm going to read, makes quite clear, is to work through the discrepancies, contradictions, and tensions inherent within Stoicism by using the latter's own theoretical means, so through a philosophy, in order to show a certain insufficiency of the Hellenic worldview. An insufficiency that requires an entirely new conceptualization of both the divine and nature. And St. Basil writes, the counterfeiters of truth, those who do not teach their mind to follow the Holy Scripture, but distort the meaning of the Holy Scriptures according to their own will, claim that it is matter that is indicated through these words. For matter, they say, is by nature without form and invisible, being according to its very logos, without quality and foreign to all forms and figures. He speaks about the creation out of matter or ex nihilo. And this is what the artificer received and formed in his wisdom. That's what they say, and let it to be orderly, and thus brought visible things into being. However, if matter is uncreated, firstly it must be equal to God, demanding the same honor. Could there be anything more impious than this? Namely, to have something without quality, without form, an extreme deformity, ugliness beyond configuration? I'm using their own expression. Enjoying the same prerogatives as the wise and powerful and all beautiful creator and maker of everything? Secondly, if matter is so great as to receive the whole episteme, knowledge, pure knowledge, perfect knowledge, episteme of God, in this way they would somehow be comparing its existence with the impenetrable power of God, since it would be able to measure by itself all the intelligence of God. On the other hand, if matter does not match the energy of God, then their argument would turn into a more absurd blasphemy. For due to the lack of matter, they would be keeping God idle and inactive as to his own works. But the poverty of human nature has deceived them. This is the opinion they have about divine creation. On the one hand, the form of the world was added by the wisdom of the maker of everything, while on the other, matter was given to the creator from without. And so the world came to be composite, having a acquired its substratum and essence from outside. And he goes on and on and on and shows this tension between the knowledge, attained with philosophy and the understanding, and then the faith of that is associated and related with the experience of the revealed God. Let's move on to Saint Gregory the Theologian. Perhaps the most important, theological works of the theologian par excellence, that is Saint Gregory Nazianzen, are his theological orations. In just 5 homilies, it was given to him by God to articulate the doctrine of the All Holy Trinity in an unprecedented and unsurpassable way. Coming as he were from a more or less Platonic background, he was well aware of the limitations and challenges of language, as well as the need to stretch the latter in order to turn ontology into aesthetics. St. Gregory takes all this to a totally new level, faced as he is with the mystery of God. At the same time, the aesthetics of his theology are turned into a fascinating insight into the anthropological demand for unity and freedom, a demand that surprisingly has awakened the interest of some of the most prominent figures in modern political theory. From the relevant passage that I will read right now, one can appreciate both his transformative intervention with regard to the Platonic perspective, his intervention in the light of faith, and his everlasting appeal to the world history of ideas. And he says, concerning God, there are 3 viewpoints of old. The non-principle, I am not here. The multi-principle, polyarchia, and the mono-principle, monarchia. The 2, of course, have been played as a game by those who are like children amongst the Hellenes, and let them be played. For what has no principle is orderless, and what has multiple principles is factious, and so of no principle, and thus orderless. And both of them lead to the same, that is, disorder, and the latter to dissolution. For disorder walks out dissolution. What is honored by us Christians in terms of faith, though, is the mono-principle. Not the mono-principle that one person encompasses, not that one. Because it is possible for the one, when it is factious to itself, to become many. But the one which parity of nature constitutes, as well as concord of will, an identity of movement, and convergence towards the one on the part of those that originate from it, the Father and those who originate from it, the Son and the Spirit. And this is unfeasible as far as created nature is concerned. And he goes on and on, very interesting words. And we go now to St. Gregory of Nyssa, and I have made an adjustment here. Now, St. Gregory of Nyssa, of course, although many a time, almost always, is regarded as a Platonist, a Neoplatonist. What is very, very interesting in his work is that the most important influence in his writing is not Platonism, not Stoicism, not Aristotelianism, but skepticism. Saint Gregory of Nyssa is really a big skeptic. And it's this skepticism, this philosophical background skepticism, that allows him constantly to subvert his own rationality. We should keep in mind that St. Gregory of Nyssa is regarded as the father of the theology of monasticism and mystical theology in the East. And as such, he subverts his rationality in order to, create this sort of theology. How does he do that? At least we have to allow for skepticism to have facilitated him. Now, in this sense, mysticism is apophatic theology. It's thanks to this, subversion of allowed by skepticism. And apophatic theology, in turn, becomes a eschatological experience, always subverting itself, subverting again and again and again within history, in light of and in favor of what is to be realized properly, totally, ultimately in the future. And of course, Saint Gregory is proliferates with paradoxes. However, because in 5 days from today we have, in the Orthodox Church, the feast of the three hierarchs, I would like to add here something about Saint John Chrysostom. Saint Gregory is very much about, Saint Gregory of Nyssa, very much about the incomprehensibility of God. This is what his theology of mysticism is all about, his monastic theology is all about, his eschatological consciousness is all about. But if there is a father from the same period, 4th, 5th century, that talks so potently, perhaps more potently than anyone in this period, before Cyril Dionysius, about the incomprehensibility of God, that's Saint John Chrysostom. And I would like to read from his work, and allow me his work on the orations against the Anomians. It is a sign of utmost madness to quarrel about knowing what God is in his essence. That there is a God, it is the prophet, knows. But he ignores what he is in his essence. That God is wise, he does know. But he ignores how much wise he is. He does not ignore that God is great. But how much great he is, or what kind is his greatness, this he does not know. That he is present everywhere he knows, but he does not know how. That he provides for and holds and keeps everything together meticulously. This he does not ignore, but he does ignore the manner according to which he achieves this. Humans have had the audacity to say that they know God in the way that God knows himself. Does this require criticism? And you see here how